In most of the ancient world, women were shadows, silent, owned, erased. But in Croydon, inside the Pythagorean order, the flame burned differently. Here, gender meant nothing. Virtue was the only passport. A soul tuned to harmony was welcomed, whether it spoke a man's voice or a woman's. Pythagoras himself said that the essence of philosophy is purification and that virtue knows no gender. The order tested courage, discipline, and moral propulsion, not lineage. That's why some of the most disciplined minds in the order were women. Theano, his wife, the philosopher who carried the school after his death. Deimo, his daughter, who refused gold for the sacred writings she inherited. Arignote, the mathematician who wrote of the divine nature of number. Maya, who taught the ethics of motherhood as harmony in motion. And Timycha of Sparta, the woman who sealed her lips with blood rather than betray truth. Theano of Croydon, often called the first woman philosopher, ruled the order after her husband's passing. She taught that the universe itself was a feminine principle of measure, nurturing, not dominating. She redefined balance not as equality of strength, but as proportion between differences. Her letters, fragments of which survive, emphasize restraint and temperance. She embodied what the Greeks called sophrosyne, the unity of self mastery and serenity. Through her, the Pythagorean order became the first philosophical circle where women studied geometry, astronomy, ethics, and medicine beside men. She built an academy where virtue, not gender, decided entry. Deimo inherited Pythagoras' manuscripts after his death. Terence offered her riches to reveal them. She refused. She said, I would rather starve than dishonor my father's oath. Arignote, her sister, turned number into theology. She wrote on the mysteries of the Mea, describing the cosmos as the eternal harmony born from the divine one. She showed that the mysticism and mathematics were never separate in the Pythagorean mind, they were mirrors. Maya, another disciple, wrote on harmony in the household, teaching that moderation in daily life is the architecture of virtue. Together, they wove philosophy into the fabric of living, ethics as geometry, discipline as devotion. Timycha came later, a Spartan woman of steel and silence. She joined the order not as a follower, but as a fighter for truth. Spartan by birth, philosopher by fire. Legends say that when Pythagoras' followers fled persecution, she and her husband, Melias, were captured by soldiers who demanded the Pythagorean order's secrets. They tortured her to speak, but she refused. When they tried to force her confession, she bit off her tongue and spat it at them, denying her captors that sound of betrayal. The ancients preserved her act not as honor, but as transcendence. They called it the highest demonstration of eukratia, which means self mastery. The Greeks admired courage in men who fought wars, but the Pythagoreans honored a greater war, the one against one's own weakness. Timycha's act was proof that mastery of self outweighed survival. She didn't die for faith, she died for ratio. For the law that harmony must be guarded from the unworthy until they can bear its weight. Her silence was not obedience, it was geometry, it was catharsis. The Pythagorean order had one central vow: never reveal to the unready what the cosmos entrusted to you. They believed the unbalanced could turn harmony into chaos, number into tyranny, and fire into ruin. Timycha's torture was therefore the final examination of the oath. Her refusal to speak proved that virtue, when perfected, is invincible. To betray truth to power would have unbalanced the world itself. She chose silence, and in doing so, preserved proportion. The inclusion of women in the Pythagorean order was not sentimental, it was metaphysical. Pythagoras saw reality as built from pairs of opposites, light and dark, odd and even, limit and limitless. Neither was superior, both were necessary for harmony. Women, he taught, embodied the principle of peras, which means limit, form, containment. Men embodied apiron, which means the unlimited, the expanding. Together they form the geometry of balance. Timycha's silence was the ultimate manifestation of peras, the boundary that preserves structure. She became the living symbol of limit, the border between chaos and truth. To the Pythagorean order, Timycha's silence wasn't tragedy, it was ascension. She had achieved the ultimate initiation, truth stronger than instinct. Theano wrote that a purified soul is a measure even in agony. That's why Timycha became a legend among later philosophers. Plutarch, Iamblichus, and Porphyry wrote her story as example, proof that the soul, once tuned, cannot be corrupted by violence. Her death echoed through centuries as the highest standard of integrity, that some knowledge must remain unspoken to survive. If you've ever refused to share what would be misunderstood, if you've ever chosen silence when words would desecrate truth, if your virtue has cost you belonging, you walk the same path as the Miha. You understand that some fire is guarded not by walls but by wounds. You're a Catharsian. Join the Catharsians today on Patreon for those who protect sacred proportion through silence. The Pythagorean path, discipline of speech, let every word justify its existence. Diogenes' beryl, defiance and purity, mock those who sell what must be earned. The Aurelius Council, keepers of silent code, leadership through restraint, virtue, not gender, decides worth. Silence, not surrender, decides strength. And the Catharsians know that. Join the Catharsians today on Patreon and reclaim your power as a leader. They bound their wrists, they demanded names, they promised mercy for betrayal. Timycha said nothing. The soldiers mocked her, then struck her. They didn't understand. They weren't hurting her body, they were testing her geometry. Every Pythagorean carried the same conviction: the soul must rule the flesh, or chaos will rule the soul. For Timycha, silence wasn't endurance, it was equilibrium. Each blow was noise, she refused to vibrate out of tune. In the Pythagorean order, pain was not evil, it was dissonance, temporary disharmony that reveals proportion. How the initiate meets pain shows whether harmony is real or rehearsed. Timycha met it with stillness. She understood that pain can reach only where the self is ungoverned. Her body was matter, her oath was number. Matter breaks, number doesn't. That clarity is what philosophers mean when they speak of virtue as knowledge. To know the order of things is to know what deserves protection, even at the cost of life. Imagine the silence in her mind before the act, the awareness that wouldn't stop, the knowledge that any word, even one screamed in agony, could fracture the sacred ratio she had sworn to guard. Timycha must have remembered her teachers, Theano's calm voice. Restraint is the highest symmetry. Deimos' warning, gold can buy words, but not worth. And perhaps the geometric figures she once traced in dust, triangle, square, pentagram, the symbols of order. When she realized the voice could betray what the mind would not, she did what no tyrant could imagine. She erased the bridge between them. She bit down, and in that blood, the oath was completed. Most people believe control means action. The ancients knew that control is abstention. Timycha's silence wasn't absence of power, it was perfection. By silencing her own voice, she denied her captors victory over meaning itself. They could wound her body, but not her ratio. They could force noise from her throat, but not knowledge from her mind. Her silence turned captivity into command. Philosophers would later call this the highest state of freedom, autarkia, which means self sufficiency of the soul. Timycha's captors didn't understand philosophy, but they sensed threat. A person who fears nothing cannot be owned. A woman who obeys no voice but the inner law terrifies every tyrant. That's why the Pythagorean order was persecuted, not for conspiracy, but for incorruptibility. They were proof that virtue could exist without permission. Timycha's silence was the loudest rebellion of her time. She didn't just guard knowledge, she humiliated power. The tone was sacred to the Pythagoreans. It represented the bridge between inner harmony and outer sound. To misuse, it was to unbalance the cosmos. Speech had to pass three gates. Is it true? Is it necessary? Is it in proportion? If any gate failed, silence was law. Timycha simply followed that rule to its limit. When truth and necessity were both forbidden, silence became the only proportion left. Her act wasn't madness, it was consistency to the final decimal. Theano's later writings on feminine virtue often alluded to Timycha without naming her. She described the woman who sealed the mouth to keep the soul unbroken. She taught that speech unworthy of the divine number desecrates the temple of the body. Through her, Timycha's act became symbol. Theano's female students were taught to practice vocal temperance, speaking less, meaning more. Timycha's sacrifice became their myth of initiation. Philosophically, Timycha's silence embodies the cosmic law of Peros, the limit that gives the infinite its form. Without limits, there is only chaos. Without silence, there is only noise. By imposing a limit upon herself, Timycha maintained proportion within the cosmos. In doing so, she joined the form of order itself. That's why her act still radiates through centuries. It's not martyrdom, it's mathematics applied to morality, it's catharsis. The Catharsians sees Timycha as the first exemplar of incorruptible consciousness. She represents the moment where integrity transcends flesh, where the mind refuses to let the world dictate value. You don't have to die to reach her state. Every time you refuse to compromise truth for approval, you repeat her act, without blood, but with the same clarity. She isn't a relic of ancient fanaticism, she's a map of discipline in its purest form. If you've ever chosen silence when the world demanded betrayal, if you've ever swallowed words to keep them sacred, if your virtue has outlasted your comfort, then Timycha walks beside you. You're a Catharsian, you're a Pythagorean. Join the Catharsians today on Patreon. Don't waste more time in the crowd. You don't belong among placeholders. For those who practice incorruptibility, the Pythagorean path, guard the tongue, speak only proportion to truth. Diogenes Barrow reject spectacle, refuse to trade authenticity for noise. The Aurelius Council form the circle of the unbroken, those whose silence commands. Freedom begins where obedience ends. This is catharsis. Join the Catharsians today on Patreon and reclaim your suppressed power as a leader. History remembers warriors for the blood they shed. Philosophy remembers Timycha for the blood she withheld. Her sacrifice wasn't death, it was definition. She proved that virtue can occupy flesh so completely that the body becomes irrelevant. She turned suffering into architecture. The Pythagorean order taught that truth is proportion, and proportion demands containment. Timycha embodied containment so absolute that even pain could not breach it. She didn't die defending secrets, she lived defending structure. Theano and Deimo kept the flame through intellect, Timycha kept it through restraint. Each preserved the same equation: order equals virtue times limit. To guard the limit is to guard creation itself. Every civilization collapses when limit dies, when speech loses reverence, when power forgets symmetry, when appetite forgets measure. Timycha's silence became the model for preservation itself. Truth must sometimes hide to survive. The modern world calls that censorship. The ancients called it wisdom. The ancient who recorded Timycha's tale noted she was a woman. The philosophers who understood it saw only discipline. They saw catharsis. Her body made the story memorable. Her virtue made it universal. In the Pythagorean order, gender never determined worth. Virtue was geometry, not anatomy. Timycha proved that the soul has no gender, only symmetry or distortion. That's why her name sits beside Theano, Deimo, Arignore, and Maya, not as exception, but as evidence that equality was encoded in the earliest philosophy. She was not a woman who equaled man, she was a human who equaled truth. Plato said ideas are more real than things. Timycha proved the inverse, that a body can become an idea. Her act was philosophy incarnate, silence elevated to the level of theorem. Every later discipline, Stoic composure, monastic vow, scientific rigor, descends from that moment when one soul proved that mastery of self is mastery of world. She turned ethics into anatomy, geometry into pulse. After Timycha's death, Theano's circle carried the story across generations. They used it as initiation, not to glorify suffering, but to teach stewardship. It reminded every disciple that wisdom demands threshold, that not every listener deserves the whole song. Even centuries later, when Plato's Academy replaced temples, the legend of the Spartan woman who beat her tongue lived on as metaphor. The philosopher must prefer truth unsaid to truth misused. In that sense, Timycha became the silent ancestor of every scholar who refuses to cheapen meaning for applause. Every act of virtue is ratio between truth and temptation. When temptation equals truth, integrity fails. When truth outweighs temptation, harmony endures. Timycha set the equation to infinity. That's why her story feels impossible. It describes purity without remainder. The Catharsian doesn't imitate her pain, they imitate her precision. They learn to calculate before speaking, to measure consequence before disclosure. Integrity is mathematics practiced emotionally. Timycha's silence wasn't withdrawal from the world, it was protection of it. By refusing to weaponize knowledge, she kept philosophy humane. That's the balance modern seekers must recover: to share enough to awaken, but not enough to corrupt, to teach without pandering, to reveal structure, not spectacle. Every Carthaginian act of careful speech continues her lineage. To the Carthaginian, Timycha is not a martyr, but a mirror. She reveals that the highest freedom is the power to say nothing when nothing pure can be said. She represents the state where emotion, intellect, and spirit obey the same law. Her legacy forms the first principle of the Catharsian path. Integrity is superior to expression. That principle separates creators from performers, philosophers from influencers, truth keepers from trend makers. If you feel truth vibrating in you when the world isn't ready to hear, if you've learned that silence can guard beauty better than noise, if your discipline frightens those who trade meaning for fame, then Timycha lives in you. You're a Catharsian. Join the Catharsians today on Patreon for those who live by her equation, the Pythagorean path. Practice vocal geometry, speak only when words match virtue. Diogenes barrel, resist spectacle, let authenticity replace applause. The Aurelius Council, lead through restraint, guide by presence, not proclamation. Theano built the school, Timycha sealed it in eternity. Now it's your turn to carry the silent fire through noise. Join the Catharsians today on Patreon and become the leader you were always meant to be.